In the shadowed folds of New Jersey's Ramapo Mountains, where ancient granite ridges meet the persistent fog of the highlands, there stands a fortress that few have ever glimpsed, a sprawling stone colossus known as Skylands, a name that captures both its lofty ambitions and its literal perch above the clouds. And this is not merely a mansion but a monument to an era when industrial titans carved their legacies into mountainsides with the same ruthless determination they applied to building empires that connected continents through copper wire and electromagnetic waves. The story begins, as all great American tales of ambition do, with a man who saw beyond the horizons that limited ordinary vision, Clarence McKenzie Lewis, a name that has faded into the whisper of history despite once commanding the attention of Wall Street and Washington alike. A telecommunications pioneer whose fortunes rose with the crackling static of early radio and the humming promise of telephone lines stretching across a rapidly modernizing nation in the 1920s. But before we speak of Lewis and his mountain domain, we must understand what came before, for Skylands was not born from his vision alone but grew from the dreams of another man, Francis Lynn Stetson, a titan of law who served as J.P. Morgan's personal attorney and whose influence shaped the very architecture of American corporate power at the turn of the 20th century. Stetson, who purchased this rugged mountaintop in 1891 and spent the next decade transforming 1,400 acres of wilderness into a gentleman's estate he called Skylands Farms, complete with a Tudor-style manor house, formal gardens that defied the rocky terrain, and a vision of pastoral aristocracy transplanted from the English countryside to the American wilderness. What drives a man already at the pinnacle of legal and financial power to invest his fortune in taming a mountain? Was it the desire to literally rise above the grasping masses, to create a kingdom where the air itself felt rarefied and exclusive, or was it something deeper, a fundamental human need to impose order upon chaos, to prove dominance over nature itself, as if subduing granite and forest could somehow validate the dominance already exercised over markets and men? Stetson's estate became a laboratory for this ambition, but it was his successor who would take these seeds and grow them into something far more audacious. Something that would transform a country retreat into a manifestation of industrial-age hubris that still commands awe nearly a century later. Enter Clarence McKenzie Lewis in 1922, a man whose fortune was built not on the solid tangibility of steel or oil but on the invisible, the electromagnetic spectrum, the crackling energy of signals transmitted through air and wire, the promise of voices carried across impossible distances, and with the brash confidence of the newly wealthy, Lewis purchased Skylands Farms for what contemporaries considered an astronomical sum, immediately announcing his intention not merely to maintain Stetson's vision but to obliterate it and rebuild something unprecedented, something that would dwarf the aspirations of mere millionaires and announce to the world that a new class of industrial royalty had arrived, one whose power flowed not from railroads or factories but from the intangible web of communication that was rapidly becoming the nervous system of modern civilization. Lewis hired the architect John Russell Pope, a name that should make anyone familiar with American monumental architecture pause with recognition. Pope, who would later design the Jefferson Memorial, the National Gallery of Art, and the National Archives in Washington, D.C., buildings that embody American aspirations to classical grandeur and democratic permanence. And here was that same visionary mind turned toward creating not a public monument but a private palace, a 44-room Jacobean revival. Manor house constructed from granite quarried from the very mountain upon which it would stand, as if Lewis wanted his home to emerge organically from the bedrock itself, an architectural manifestation of his belief that he had earned his place atop this world through sheer force of will and vision. The construction itself was a marvel and a scandal, employing hundreds of workers during an era when labor was cheap and safety regulations were suggestions rather than requirements. How many men fell from those granite walls? How many crushed fingers and broken backs were the hidden cost of each perfectly fitted stone? How many immigrant laborers returned to cramped tenements in nearby towns with bodies aged beyond their years, all so that Lewis could enjoy tea on a terrace overlooking 3 states? The house rose between 1922 and 1924, a period of fevered construction that saw the mountainside transformed into something between a construction site and an occupied territory, with temporary housing for workers, dedicated rail spurs bringing materials up the mountain, and a constant flow of craftsmen, stonemasons from Italy who understood the old-world techniques necessary to create the effect Lewis desired, woodworkers who hand-carved the interior paneling that gave each room the feel of an English manor house transplanted wholesale to American soil, landscape architects who terraformed the rocky slopes into formal gardens that would have made Capability Brown envious, all orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign and the budget of a man who believed his wealth was limitless. The completed Skylands Manor, for that is what Lewis christened his creation, dropping the modest farms designation as if to emphasize that this was no longer a mere estate but something grander, a seat of power, sprawled across the mountaintop with 44 rooms, though that number obscures the true scale, for these were not ordinary rooms but vast chambers with soaring ceilings, each appointed with furnishings and artworks acquired from European estates fallen on hard times in the aftermath of World War I, a collection that transformed the house into a museum of aristocratic decline, where every piece whispered stories of old money surrendering to new, of titled families selling their heritage to American industrialists who craved the patina of legitimacy that only age and pedigree could provide. The grounds were no less ambitious. Pope and the landscape architect designed a series of gardens that cascaded down the mountainside in carefully orchestrated stages, each themed and separated, including a formal Italianate garden with fountains and statuary, an English perennial garden that bloomed in coordinated waves of color throughout the growing season, a winter garden designed to provide visual interest even when snow blanketed the ground, and perhaps most audaciously, a collection of specimen trees from around the world, transforming the estate into a botanical museum where Lewis could walk among species that had no natural business growing in New Jersey's climate, kept alive through sheer determination and the constant ministrations of a small army of gardeners who battled frost, drought, and disease to maintain the illusion of effortless abundance. But what was life actually like within these granite walls? And who was this man who commanded such resources with such apparent ease? Clarence Lewis was, by all contemporary accounts, a complicated figure, driven, visionary in his business dealings, yet oddly insecure in his personal life, a man who had climbed to heights that would satisfy most but who seemed perpetually anxious about his place in the social hierarchy, as if he understood intuitively that the old money establishment whose lifestyle he emulated would never fully accept him, that he would always be new money, telecommunications money, money that lacked the gravitas of railroad fortunes or industrial dynasties that stretched back generations. His marriage to Florence Pedrick Lewis brought him social connections and a wife who shared his ambitions for social prominence, yet their life at Skylands was marked by a peculiar isolation. Certainly they entertained, hosting weekend parties for business associates and social climbers, but contemporaneous accounts suggest these gatherings had a forced quality, as if Lewis were always performing the role of lord of the manor rather than inhabiting it naturally, and one wonders whether the guests, as they sipped champagne on terraces overlooking the cloud-draped valleys below, sensed this fundamental awkwardness, this gap between the grandeur of the setting and the insecurity of the host. The household required a staggering staff to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury. At its peak, Skylands employed over 50 servants, a number that included butlers, maids, cooks, footmen, gardeners, groundskeepers, chauffeurs, and various specialized roles that modern Americans would struggle to even name. And these individuals, whose names history has mostly forgotten, lived in their own quarters in the basement and attic levels of the manor, existing in a separate world that brushed against the gilded existence of the Lewis family only in moments of service, invisible hands that laid fires, pressed clothes, prepared elaborate meals, maintained the gardens, and ensured that when Lewis awoke each morning, his world was perfectly ordered, every surface gleaming, every flower in place, every mechanical convenience functioning seamlessly. But at what cost to these individuals, who spent their lives maintaining someone else's dream, who climbed the mountain each day to work in magnificent spaces they could never claim as their own, who polished furniture they would never sit upon and prepared meals they would never taste, all for wages that, while perhaps better than alternatives available to working-class Americans of the 1920s, were nonetheless a pittance compared to the wealth flowing through the household they served? Lewis's fortune, built on telecommunications, was intimately tied to the technological revolutions transforming American life. He had positioned himself at the intersection of telephone networks, radio broadcasting, and the emerging possibility of television, holding patents and corporate positions that generated wealth with the seemingly effortless abundance of a spring welling from underground. Yet this wealth was also precarious in ways that older industrial fortunes were not, dependent on licensing agreements, on favorable regulatory decisions, on the maintenance of monopolistic advantages that could evaporate if political winds shifted or if competitors emerged with superior technologies or more aggressive business practices. And indeed, by the late 1920s, storm clouds were gathering, though Lewis, ensconced in his mountain retreat, may not have fully grasped the magnitude of the approaching catastrophe. The stock market that had soared throughout the decade, carrying telecommunication stocks to dizzying heights and multiplying Lewis's paper wealth beyond even his ambitious expectations, had become dangerously detached from underlying economic realities, a bubble of speculation and leverage that would, inevitably, catastrophically burst. The crash of 1929 did not immediately destroy Lewis. He was too well positioned, too diversified, too cautious in some respects. But it began the slow erosion of his fortune, and more importantly, it transformed the social environment in which extreme displays of wealth had been celebrated into one where they became liabilities, where ostentatious consumption was no longer admired but resented, where mansions like Skylands began to seem less like achievements and more like obscenities, monuments to the greed and excess that had led the nation into economic catastrophe. Did Lewis feel the winds shifting as he walked through his gardens in the early 1930s, as the Depression deepened and breadlines lengthened in cities visible from his mountaintop? Or did the height of his perch insulate him from the suffering below, allowing him to maintain his lifestyle even as the nation convulsed? The answer seems to be somewhere between. Lewis certainly felt the financial pressure as telecommunications revenues contracted and his investment portfolio hemorrhaged value, but he maintained Skylands through the early Depression years, perhaps unable to imagine abandoning his monument, perhaps still believing that economic recovery would restore his fortunes, perhaps simply unwilling to admit defeat by retreating from the heights he had attained. But by 1937, after 15 years of occupancy, the weight of maintaining Skylands had become unsustainable. The staff had been reduced, the gardens showed signs of neglect, the house itself required constant expensive repairs, and Lewis's business interests, while not entirely destroyed, no longer generated the surplus necessary to fund such extravagance, and so, with what one imagines was considerable anguish and perhaps relief, he made the decision to sell, placing Skylands on the market and retreating to more modest accommodations, ending his reign as the mountain's telecommunications king. The buyer who emerged was perhaps even more interesting than Lewis himself. Francis Lynn Stetson Jr., son of the estate's original developer, who had maintained family connections to the property and who saw in Skylands not a monument to personal achievement but a legacy to be preserved, and with considerable family wealth behind him, he purchased the estate in 1937, reversing some of Lewis's more ostentatious additions and attempting to restore something of his father's original vision, though the intervening years had transformed the property in ways that could not be entirely undone. But Stetson Jr.'s ownership would prove brief and troubled. The Second World War created impossible conditions for maintaining such estates, as staff joined military service or found more lucrative war industry employment, as luxury goods became unavailable, as the entire notion of aristocratic leisure seemed increasingly anachronistic in a nation mobilized for total war, and in 1945, Stetson Jr. made a decision that would forever transform Skylands. He donated the estate to the state of New Jersey to become part of the Ringwood State Park system, a conversion from private palace to public space that was occurring at estates across America as the old order collapsed and a new, more democratic vision of land use emerged. The state's acquisition of Skylands in 1945 should have been a triumph. Here was a magnificent property, an architectural gem, becoming accessible to ordinary citizens who could never have hoped to visit during its private years, a democratization of beauty and space that aligned perfectly with post-war American ideals. Yet the reality proved far more complicated, for the state, even with its vast resources, struggled to maintain Skylands at anywhere near its former glory, and the transition from private estate to public park revealed uncomfortable truths about the hidden costs of grandeur. Without the constant infusion of private wealth, without the dedicated staff that had numbered in the dozens, without the detailed attention that only single-minded purpose can provide, Skylands began to decay, not catastrophically at first, but in incremental ways that accumulated over years. Gardens became overgrown, rare plantings died and were replaced with common species. Interior furnishings were removed or deteriorated, roof leaks went unrepaired, and slowly, inexorably, the house began its slide from palace to ruin, a transformation that raises profound questions about whether such monuments can exist in a democratic society, whether they are inevitably tied to the concentration of private wealth that makes their creation possible, or whether we might imagine a social order that could maintain such beauty without requiring the exploitation and inequality that funds it. For decades, from the 1950s through the 1980s, Skylands existed in a kind of limbo, technically preserved as a historic site, actually declining despite periodic maintenance efforts, used occasionally for state functions but largely closed to the public, too expensive to maintain properly but too historically significant to abandon, a white elephant that successive state administrations struggled to manage, each hoping that someone else would find a solution that would allow the preservation of the structure without the politically unpalatable expenditure of public funds that would be necessary to truly restore it to its former condition. The mansion's fate seemed sealed toward tragedy until an unexpected development in the 1980s, a growing public awareness of the estate's botanical significance, for while the house had deteriorated, many of the rare plantings in Lewis's specimen gardens had survived, creating what botanists recognized as one of the most significant collections of its kind in the northeastern United States, with trees and plants from Asia, Europe, and South America that had adapted to the New Jersey climate in ways that defied expectations, creating a living museum of horticultural achievement that was arguably more valuable scientifically than the house was architecturally. This recognition catalyzed the formation of the Skylands Association in 1976, a volunteer organization dedicated to preserving the gardens and, by extension, the house that anchored them. Here was a new model, neither pure private ownership nor pure state management, but a public-private partnership where volunteers provided labor and expertise, where private donations supplemented state funding, where passionate individuals who had fallen under Skyland's spell devoted countless hours to reversing decades of neglect, and slowly, incrementally the estate began to recover, a process that continues to this day and that has transformed Skylands from a declining ruin into a functioning historic house museum and botanical garden that attracts thousands of visitors annually. The restoration of Skylands raises fascinating questions about preservation and memory. What are we actually preserving when we maintain such estates? Whose story are we telling? And what lessons do we want visitors to draw from their experience? The current interpretation at Skylands attempts to balance multiple narratives, celebrating the architectural and botanical achievements while also acknowledging the wealth extraction and labor exploitation that made such achievements possible, honoring the craftsmanship and vision while also questioning the social systems that concentrated such resources in so few hands, allowing visitors to experience the beauty and grandeur while also prompting reflection on the costs, both human and environmental, of such monuments. Walking through Skylands today, one experiences these competing narratives in complex ways. The restored gardens are undeniably magnificent, testimony to human capacity to create beauty and to work with nature in sophisticated ways, yet plaques and interpretive materials remind visitors that these gardens required dozens of full-time gardeners during the Lewis era, that the specimens were often collected through colonial exploitation of other continents, that the very concept of a private mountain represented a concentration of land ownership that displaced indigenous peoples and working-class communities who had previously accessed these forests for subsistence. The house interior, with its soaring great hall and imported furnishings, inspires awe at human artistic achievement, yet the servants' quarters in the basement, now also preserved and interpreted, tell a stark counter-narrative of the invisible labor force whose toil made the illusion of effortless luxury possible, whose lives were constrained and controlled in ways that modern visitors find disturbing, whose names and stories were largely unrecorded because they were considered unimportant by the very people who depended absolutely on their work. The telecommunications industry that funded Lewis's mountain kingdom has itself undergone revolutionary transformations since the 1920s. The companies and technologies that generated his wealth have been superseded multiple times over, by television, by cellular networks, by the internet, by technologies Lewis could not have imagined even as he positioned himself at the cutting edge of his era's communications revolution. And this progression raises interesting questions about the nature of industrial wealth and legacy. Unlike the Vanderbilt's railroad fortunes or the Rockefellers' oil wealth, which were built on relatively stable technologies that dominated for generations, Lewis's telecommunications empire was built on inherently ephemeral technologies, on patents that would expire and systems that would become obsolete, making his fortune more precarious and his legacy more dependent on the specific historical moment he occupied. One of the most poignant aspects of the Skylands story is how completely Clarence Lewis has been forgotten. Despite creating one of New Jersey's most significant architectural landmarks, despite his importance in early telecommunications history, despite his wealth and social ambitions, his name is barely remembered, and when people visit Skylands today, they often know nothing of the man who built it, or they confuse his story with those of other Gilded Age industrialists whose narratives have become more embedded in popular consciousness. This erasure raises questions about what we remember and why, about which industrial titans achieve lasting fame and which fade into obscurity, about whether Lewis's particular combination of new technology, social climbing, and relative brevity of ownership somehow made him less memorable than figures whose wealth was older, whose social position was more secure, or whose personalities were more flamboyant. The mountain itself, the granite bones upon which Lewis built his dream, has witnessed this entire drama with geological indifference. The Ramapo Mountains are ancient, formed hundreds of millions of years ago through tectonic forces that dwarfed even the most ambitious human engineering, and from the mountain's perspective Lewis's occupancy was a mere moment, a brief disturbance of the surface that has already been partially reclaimed by the forest that surrounded his carved gardens, and, indeed, even in areas where the Skylands Association has not focused restoration efforts, nature has begun the slow work of erasure with roots cracking foundations, with weather-wearing stone, with the inexorable processes of entropy that will eventually, whether in decades or centuries, return even the most substantial human constructions to the earth from which they were extracted. The view from Skylands terraces remains extraordinary. On clear days, visitors can see into 3 states, can watch weather systems develop and sweep across the valleys below, can experience something of what Lewis must have felt as he surveyed his domain from this elevated perspective. And it's easy to understand the seductive quality of such a view, the way it creates a sense of mastery and separation, the way it allows those who possess it to imagine themselves above and apart from common humanity, literally looking down on the world. Yet this same view also reveals the essential illusion of that separation, for the mountain is not apart from the world but deeply connected to it, shaped by the same geological forces, subject to the same weather, dependent on the same ecosystems, and the humans who occupy its summit, regardless of their wealth or power, remain fundamentally vulnerable to forces far larger than themselves, remain subject to economic cycles they cannot control, to social transformations they cannot prevent, to the biological reality that their time atop the mountain will be brief and their monuments, however substantial, will eventually crumble. Today, Skylands serves multiple functions simultaneously. It is a New Jersey State Botanical Garden, maintaining and expanding the plant collections that Lewis established and making them accessible to researchers and enthusiasts. It is a historic house museum, offering tours that interpret early 20th century architecture and domestic life. It is a popular wedding and event venue, with the romantic stone walls and formal gardens providing backdrop for contemporary celebrations that Lewis might have found either validating or horrifying, depending on whether his ghost would appreciate the democratic access or lament the commercial use of his private domain. It is an educational facility, hosting school groups and workshops that teach everything from horticulture to history to the ecology of the Ramapo Mountains. And perhaps most importantly, it is simply a beautiful public space where ordinary citizens can experience grandeur and natural beauty without wealth, where families can picnic on lawns that once were exclusive, where anyone who makes the journey up the mountain can, for a few hours, inhabit a world of carefully cultivated beauty that was created by concentrated wealth but has been transformed, through the strange alchemy of historical change, into a shared public good. The transformation from private palace to public park represents a broader narrative in American history, the democratic impulse that has gradually opened spaces and experiences that were once restricted to elites, the social evolution that has made hereditary aristocracy impossible even as it has allowed the emergence of new forms of concentrated wealth and power, the ongoing tension between private property rights and public access, between individual achievement and collective benefit, between the desire to preserve historical artifacts and the need to critique the systems that created them. Skylands embodies all these tensions, serving as a physical location where visitors can grapple with complex questions about wealth, labor, beauty, preservation, and justice without easy answers but with the visceral, embodied experience of actually occupying the spaces where these historical forces played out. If we consider Skylands as a mirror reflecting American society across a century, what do we see? We see the extraordinary productive capacity of industrial capitalism, the way it could marshal resources and talent to create objects of genuine beauty and achievement. We also see the brutal inequalities that made such creation possible, the invisible labor and environmental exploitation that funded every carefully fitted stone. We see human ambition in its most naked form, the desire not just for comfort or security but for dominance, for legacy, for immortality through architecture. We also see the ultimate futility of that ambition, the way that even the most substantial monuments depend on constant maintenance, on the continued investment of resources and attention, on social systems that choose to preserve rather than destroy. We see the democratizing impulse of American society, the way that private empires eventually, through various mechanisms, become public spaces. We also see the inadequacy of public funding to maintain spaces at the level that private wealth could achieve, raising uncomfortable questions about what we lose in the transition from private to public ownership. We see changing attitudes toward wealth and display, from the unembarrassed ostentation of the 1920s to Depression-era resentment to contemporary ambivalence that simultaneously critiques extreme wealth and remains fascinated by its manifestations. We see the importance of volunteers and nonprofit organizations in preserving cultural heritage, the way that passionate individuals can accomplish preservation that neither pure market forces nor pure government action would achieve, and we see, ultimately, the human desire for beauty, for order, for meaning, played out across a mountain landscape that predates humanity and will persist long after the last stone of Skylands Manor has crumbled into picturesque ruin. As we stand today on the terraces of Skylands, a century removed from its construction, the essential questions remain unresolved. Can we preserve the beauty created by unjust systems without celebrating those systems? How do we balance appreciation for architectural and botanical achievement with acknowledgement of the exploitation that funded it? What do we owe to the forgotten servants and laborers whose work made such estates possible? How do we maintain expensive historical sites in a democratic society with limited public resources? What lessons should contemporary wealth holders draw from the stories of places like Skylands? That their monuments will eventually become public spaces, that their legacies will be reinterpreted through lenses they cannot control, that the attempt to achieve permanence through architecture is ultimately futile, or conversely, that such monuments do achieve a kind of immortality even if the original owners are forgotten and the meanings attributed to their creations transform beyond recognition. The telecommunications networks that built Lewis's fortune have evolved into the internet that now connects billions of people globally, creating new fortunes that make Lewis's wealth seem quaint, funding new monuments to contemporary egos, and one wonders whether the tech billionaires of our era, building their compounds and private islands and space programs, recognize themselves in Lewis's story, whether they see the cautionary tale of impermanence and the inevitable public reckoning with concentrated wealth, or whether each generation of the wealthy believes itself different, believes its wealth is more justified, its monuments more necessary, its legacy more secure. Skylands endures, neither frozen in time nor entirely transformed, a palimpsest where multiple historical layers remain visible to those willing to look carefully, where you can simultaneously experience Gilded Age grandeur and contemporary public access, where the beauty of the gardens coexists with interpretation of the labor systems that created them, where architectural achievement is celebrated even as the social order that produced it is critiqued, and in this complex, sometimes contradictory existence, Skylands offers something more valuable than simple preservation or simple condemnation. It offers an opportunity for reflection, for grappling with difficult questions about the society we have inherited and the society we are creating, for experiencing firsthand the heights that human ambition can achieve and the costs, both obvious and hidden, of such achievement. The mountain remains, as it has for hundreds of millions of years, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its summit, and perhaps there is wisdom in that geological perspective, in recognizing that our monuments, however substantial, however meaningful to us, are temporary markings on a landscape that vastly exceeds our comprehension, that the truly permanent features of Skylands are not Lewis's walls or gardens but the bedrock itself, the forest that reclaims any space we cease to defend, the cycles of weather and season that continue regardless of human presence. And yet, this recognition of impermanence need not lead to nihilism or resignation but rather to a deeper appreciation for the beauty and meaning we create during our brief occupancy, to gratitude that someone thought to preserve this particular manifestation of human aspiration so that we, a century later, can walk its paths and sit in its gardens and allow our minds to wander across questions of wealth and power and beauty and justice that have no final answers but reward the asking. The question of what Skylands represents to contemporary visitors arriving via the winding mountain roads cannot be separated from their own relationships with wealth, labor, and aspiration. A middle-class family pulling into the parking lot in their modest sedan experiences the estate differently than a tech entrepreneur who arrives having just closed a funding round worth millions, differently than the elderly volunteer gardener who has spent decades nurturing the specimen plants, differently than the bride who has rented the space for her wedding and sees it primarily as a backdrop for Instagram-worthy photographs, and these varying perspectives, rather than representing a failure of unified interpretation, actually enrich the site's meaning, transforming it from a static historical artifact into a living space where contemporary Americans negotiate their relationships with a past that simultaneously inspires and troubles them. The wedding industry's embrace of Skylands, and similar historic estates across the nation, reveals particularly interesting cultural dynamics, for these events represent a kind of temporary aristocratic cosplay, allowing ordinary people to inhabit spaces of grandeur for a few hours, to have their photographs taken on terraces where industrial titans once stood, to make their own memories in rooms designed for a completely different social order, and there is something simultaneously democratic and uncomfortable about this phenomenon. Democratic in that spaces once restricted to elites now host celebrations for people of modest means, uncomfortable in that it treats the settings of historical inequality as romantic backdrops, potentially obscuring the darker realities of how such spaces function during their private years. When a contemporary couple exchanges vows in Skylands Gardens, surrounded by specimen plantings that Lewis installed to demonstrate his wealth and sophistication, are they participating in the democratization of beauty, or are they perpetuating, even unconsciously, the aesthetic and social values that such estates embodied? The answer, unsatisfyingly but accurately, is probably both. Humans are complex creatures capable of simultaneously appreciating beauty and critiquing the systems that created it, capable of making personal meaning in spaces heavy with historical significance, and the fact that a site can serve multiple, sometimes contradictory purposes is not a weakness but rather evidence of its cultural richness and continued relevance. The financial model that currently sustains Skylands, a combination of state funding, private donations, volunteer labor, and event rental income, represents a pragmatic solution to the challenge of maintaining expensive historical properties in an era of limited public resources, yet it also creates tensions and compromises that would have been foreign to Lewis and his contemporaries, for whom the estate's purpose was simply to provide private enjoyment and social validation, with no need to justify its existence through educational programming or public access or revenue generation. The modern Skylands must constantly balance competing demands. Preservation purists want historically accurate restoration regardless of cost or accessibility concerns. Educators want spaces configured for group learning rather than period authenticity. Event planners want amenities like catering facilities and modern restrooms that inevitably compromise historical integrity. Botanists want to expand collections in ways that may conflict with landscape preservation. Accessibility advocates rightly demand that a public space serve visitors with disabilities even when modifications to historic structures are required, and sustainability advocates push for environmental practices that Lewis never contemplated. Managing these competing interests requires compromises that satisfy no constituency completely but allow the estate to continue functioning as a multi-use public space rather than becoming either a pristine but inaccessible museum or a degraded venue that has lost its historical character entirely. The botanical collections at Skylands deserve particular attention, for they represent an achievement that has arguably outlasted and surpassed the architectural significance of the house itself. Lewis's decision to create a specimen garden, collecting unusual and rare plants from around the world, was initially an act of conspicuous consumption, a way of demonstrating both wealth and sophistication, for such collections required not only the capital to acquire expensive specimens but also the ongoing resources to maintain them, including skilled gardeners, specialized equipment, and the constant attention necessary to keep plants alive in climates they had not evolved to inhabit. Yet nearly a century later, these collections have accumulated scientific and cultural value that Lewis could not have anticipated. Some of the trees and plants at Skylands are now among the oldest examples of their species in cultivation in North America, providing valuable data about how exotic species adapt to northeastern climates over multiple generations. The gardens serve as a genetic repository for plant varieties that may have declined or disappeared in their native ranges due to habitat loss, climate change, or other environmental pressures, and the accumulated knowledge embodied in the landscape, which plantings thrive together, which microclimates suit particular species, which maintenance practices prove sustainable over decades, represents a form of practical wisdom that cannot be easily replicated and that grows more valuable as climate change forces gardeners and land managers to consider species that were once considered unsuitable for their regions. In this sense, Lewis's vanity project has been transformed by time and changing contexts into a genuinely valuable scientific and educational resource, a transformation that raises interesting questions about how we should evaluate the legacies of the wealthy. Should we give Lewis credit for creating something of lasting value even if that value was unintentional and even if the creation process involved exploitation and environmental extraction? Or should we maintain a critical distance, acknowledging the value that has emerged while refusing to valorize the original creator whose motivations and methods we might find objectionable? The staff quarters at Skylands, now preserved and interpreted as part of the historic house tour, tell stories that complicate and deepen our understanding of the estate's history in ways that would have been impossible during Lewis's lifetime, when such spaces were deliberately kept invisible to guests, who were meant to experience the household as running with magical efficiency, with meals appearing perfectly prepared, with rooms cleaned and fires laid without any visible human agency, with the extensive labor required to maintain the estate carefully hidden behind green baize doors and servant staircases that allowed staff to move through the house without encountering family or guests. The contemporary decision to open these spaces to visitors, to tell the stories of cooks and maids and gardeners alongside the stories of owners and architects, represents a historiographical shift towards social history that values the experiences of ordinary people, that recognizes that any complete understanding of how such estates function must account for the workers whose labor made them possible, and the contrast between the grand public spaces and the cramped, utilitarian staff quarters is stark and deliberate, designed to provoke reflection on the human costs of grandeur, on the radical inequality that characterized even supposedly enlightened households, on the way that some people's comfort and luxury was purchased through other people's constrained lives and deferred dreams. Yet even this interpretation faces challenges and limitations. The actual individuals who worked at Skylands during the Lewis era left few records, their inner lives and perspectives largely irrecoverable, so contemporary interpretation necessarily involves speculation and generalization, projecting onto these historical workers attitudes and experiences that may or may not reflect their actual reality, and there is a risk of patronizing or sentimentalizing these workers, of assuming they were simply victims without agency, of failing to recognize the ways they might have taken pride in their skills, found satisfaction in their work, created meaningful lives and relationships within the constraints they faced, or actively resisted and subverted the power dynamics of the household in ways both subtle and significant. The surrounding Ringwood State Park, into which Skylands was incorporated in 1945, provides important ecological and historical context that helps situate the estate within larger patterns of land use and environmental change in the northeastern United States. The Ramapo Mountains were once part of an extensive forest ecosystem that covered much of the region, inhabited by Lenape peoples whose relationship with the land involved seasonal movements and resource use patterns that maintained ecological balance over millennia, until European colonization brought dramatic transformations including deforestation for agriculture and charcoal production, industrial mining operations that extracted iron ore from the mountains to supply forges and foundries, and eventually the creation of large private estates like Skylands that represented a kind of reforestation, though one shaped by aesthetic rather than ecological priorities, with native forests replaced by designed landscapes that prioritized visual effect and exotic specimens over ecosystem function. The long-term ecological consequences of such estates are complex and ambiguous. On one hand, they preserved large tracts of land from suburban development and maintained tree cover that provides habitat and ecosystem services. On the other hand, they introduced numerous non-native species that sometimes became invasive. They fragmented habitat and disrupted wildlife corridors. They altered hydrology and soil chemistry through landscaping activities, and they embodied a view of nature as something to be controlled and arranged for human enjoyment rather than something possessing intrinsic value independent of human purposes. Contemporary management of Skylands must grapple with these legacies, deciding which non-native plantings to maintain as historically significant and which to remove as ecologically problematic, determining how to balance the preservation of designed landscapes with the restoration of native ecosystems, considering how climate change is already altering which species can survive in the gardens and what that means for long-term management strategies. The experience of visiting Skylands on a foggy autumn morning when the mountain is wrapped in clouds and the stone walls emerge from mist like something from a Gothic novel, when the specimen trees reveal their autumn colors in muted, mysterious tones and the gardens take on a melancholy beauty that seems to embody the passage of time itself, is profoundly different from visiting on a brilliant summer afternoon when the estate buzzes with activity, with wedding parties posing for photographs, with families picnicking on the lawns, with tour groups moving through the house, with volunteers working in the gardens, and both experiences are authentic, both reveal different aspects of the site's character and meaning, but the foggy solitary visit perhaps allows for deeper reflection on the themes of ambition and impermanence, wealth and loss, human aspiration and natural indifference that make the Skylands story so compelling. Standing alone on the terrace in such conditions, one can almost sense the presence of Lewis himself, can imagine him surveying his creation with a mixture of pride and anxiety, perhaps already sensing even in his moment of triumph that his hold on this mountain was temporary, that the forces that had elevated him could also destroy him, that the telegraph and telephone lines stretching across the valleys below, invisible threads of electromagnetic energy that had made his fortune, were themselves already being superseded by new technologies that would render his business model obsolete, and perhaps in such moments of clarity he understood what the mountain had always known, that human constructions, however impressive, are merely temporary markings on a landscape that vastly exceeds our individual lives, That the granite beneath his imported tiles had existed for hundreds of millions of years and would persist long after his manor house had crumbled into picturesque ruin. That the only permanence available to humans is the kind that comes not from resisting change but from accepting it, not from building monuments intended to last forever but from creating things of sufficient beauty and meaning that others choose to preserve them even as their original purposes and meanings transform. The question of how Skylands should evolve in coming decades remains open and contested. Some preservationists argue for a return to the estate's 1920s appearance, a complete restoration that would recreate Lewis's vision in meticulous detail, turning the site into a kind of living museum of jazz-age wealth and ostentation. Others advocate for a more dynamic approach that acknowledges the site's layered history, maintaining elements from different eras and uses rather than privileging any single historical moment. Still others push for transformation toward primarily botanical and ecological purposes, de-emphasizing the house and social history in favor of expanding plant collections and native habitat restoration. And a pragmatic faction simply wants to maintain the current mixed-use approach that generates enough revenue and public support to keep the site functioning without requiring massive infusions of public funding. Each approach embodies different values and priorities, different visions of what historical preservation means and what obligations contemporary society has to the past, and the ongoing negotiation between these positions is itself a form of democratic engagement with heritage. A recognition that sites like Skylands belong not to any individual or even any single generation but rather to an ongoing community of stakeholders that includes current visitors, future generations, the ecosystems and non-human species that inhabit the mountain, and even in some metaphysical sense the historical individuals whose labor and vision created the estate, whose claims on its meaning and use cannot be entirely dismissed even though they are no longer present to advocate for themselves. The telecommunications revolution that funded Lewis's mountain dreams has continued accelerating in ways that would astound him. The copper wires and vacuum tubes of his era have given way to fiber optics and satellites, to digital networks that carry not just voice but video and data, to a globally interconnected communication infrastructure that makes the telegraph networks of the 1920s seem as primitive as smoke signals, and the fortunes generated by contemporary telecommunications and internet companies dwarf even the massive wealth of Lewis's era, creating new classes of billionaires who face their own questions about legacy and meaning, who build their own monuments and vanity projects, who grapple with their own versions of the questions that must have troubled Lewis during his years atop the mountain: how to use wealth in ways that create lasting meaning rather than just temporary pleasure, how to achieve the social validation and historical remembrance that money alone cannot purchase, how to construct lives that feel purposeful and significant rather than merely comfortable. If Lewis could return to Skylands today and see his private palace transformed into a public park, see strangers wandering through his gardens and posing for selfies on his terrace, see his carefully curated collections maintained by volunteers rather than paid staff, see the whole enterprise functioning as an educational and recreational facility rather than a private retreat, would he feel vindicated that his creation has endured and continues to provide beauty and meaning, or would he feel betrayed that his private vision has been collectivized, that the exclusivity that was central to the estate's original purpose has been entirely eliminated, that the social hierarchy embodied in the architectural separation between family spaces and servant quarters is now critiqued rather than celebrated? Perhaps he would experience both reactions simultaneously, pride and dismay intermingled, and perhaps that ambivalence would be appropriate, for the transformation of Skylands from private palace to public park is genuinely both a triumph and a loss, a triumph of democratic access and social evolution, a loss of the focused vision and concentrated resources that created the estate's distinctive character in the first place, and our inability to reconcile these competing values to declare definitively whether the transformation represents progress or decline, is not a failure of analysis but rather an honest acknowledgement of the genuine complexity of the issues involved, the way that most significant historical changes involve trade-offs rather than pure gains or losses, the necessity of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously if we want to understand the full meaning of places like Skylands and the stories they tell about wealth, power, beauty, labor, and the peculiar dynamics of American society across more than a century of dramatic transformation.